بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا رسول الله وعلى آله وصحبه ومن والاه. Welcome back everyone to a new lesson. This is lesson 5 and inshallah we're going to complete the text on this section of inheritance, and in the next class we'll move to a new text as I've mentioned. And in today's class we're basically going to take the last two sections, which is bequests, the wasiyah, and then the executors of the wasiyah. The executors is a pretty straightforward thing, so the bulk of this lecture will be about the bequest themselves. We left off in the last class talking about 1/3, that one can leave up to 1/3 as a bequest. There's still some detail about that. How is the 1/3 valued? Is the value taken at the time in which the item is given as a bequest, or when it comes into ownership? There's a little bit of detail I want to go over in that. What happens if somebody gives a bequest of 1/3 or less, but then there are too many debts, and then the debt encompasses the entire estate? What happens then, therefore, to the bequest? And then what happens if somebody gives a bequest either over 1/3 or gives a bequest to somebody who will naturally inherit? So the Prophet ﷺ said, "La wasiyatu liwarith," there is no bequest to somebody who will inherit, and except by the permission of those people that will inherit. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. We will talk about the impermissibility of bequesting something that's haram, or something that has ma'siyah in it, something that has a sin involved in it. And then we accept the bequest from anyone who's mature and of sound mind. Again, a little bit of details there. And then by extension, we talk about the executors, those people who will carry out the bequest, or any other sort of post-life scenarios. What are the conditions for those people, the conditions that are mentioned in the text, but also some additional conditions that will come from the commentary literature, which basically the person has to be physically able. It can't be like too old or too sick to do it. And then that will take us to conclusion of the Matn of Abi Shuja on the subject of inheritance, and we will shift gears with that to the next text in the next class. So that's the game plan for today. See you back here for the next discussion, inshallah. So we begin the way we normally begin, which is to turn to the text itself of Abi Shuja radiallahu anhu. I'm just going to read actually the whole wasiyah thing because it's so short in the Arabic, and then we'll do the translation and proceed. قال المصنف رحمه الله ونفعنا بعلومه في الدارين آمين. فصل في الوصية. وتجوز الوصية بالمعلوم والمجهول وبالموجود والمعدوم، وهي من الثلث، فإن زاد وقف على إجازة الورثة، ولا يجوز الوصية لوارث إلا أن يجيزها باقي الورثة، وتصح الوصية من كل بالغ عاقل لكل متملك وفي سبيل الله تعالى، وتصح الوصية إلى ما اجتمعت فيه 5 خصال: الإسلام والبلوغ والعقل والحرية والأمانة. لا وصية لوارث, that hadith, that's the main dalil. Let me see if there's anything. As far as the wasiyah being part of the inheritance and distributed before the inheritance share, we have in Surah An-Nisa, مِن بَعْدِ وَصِيَّةٍ يُوصَى بِهَا أَوْ دَيْنٍ, that the inheritance share are given after the bequest is given. أَوْ دَيْنٍ, or a debt. Okay, لا وصية لوارث, that's the main hadith. That's going to be narrated in Abu Dawood and the Tirmidhi and others. Ad-Daraqutni narrates on the authority of Ibn Abbas, لا تجوز وصية لوارث إلا أن يشاء الورثة. You cannot give a bequest to somebody who inherit except if the people that inherit agree. So that's a specific text. And as I said before, it's a specific hadith, and the text of the Matn of Abi Shuja is lifted from the hadith. So oftentimes what you find in these documents in these manuals of law is that it's just lifted from the text. I realize now that I forgot to read the translation, and I went to the dalil first. So let me go back and read the translation. So Qadi Abu Shuja, he says, Rahimahullah, radiallahu anhu, may Allah Ta'ala have mercy on him and may we benefit from his knowledge in this world and in the next. Testamentary bequests. It is permissible to bequeath something, whether specific or not, currently existing or not. We talked about that in the last class. Testamentary bequests are only permissible when their total is less than 1/3 of the estate. The validity of bequests exceeding 1/3 is dependent on consent of the deceased heirs. It is not permissible to bequeath something to one of the heirs unless the other heirs permit it. Bequests are valid from anyone who is mature and of sound mind to anyone who can own property or for the sake of Allah Ta'ala. Executors, it is valid to appoint someone executor. It is valid to appoint someone executor if he possesses the following 5 qualities. He must be a Muslim, mature, of sound mind, free and trustworthy. Okay, commentary. Let me get my page. All right, so the main number is 1/3. One more fraction, since this is the chapter of fractions. So there's 1/3 is you're allowed to leave as a bequest of 1/3. Now, there are different times when you can give a bequest. If you give a bequest and it is given right away, then at the moment it comes into the possession of the person whom will take it, that's the value of that item. If the bequest is a bequest upon death, so when I die, I'm going to give you this book, then when I die, what is the value of this book is the value of the book. Now, the value of the bequest or the value of the estate that will stay after, that will be distributed to the inheritors after you die, we will take the lesser amount, the amount at the time of death of those things from the amount of time you receive it. So, for example, let's say my library, which is most of what I own, will be distributed. The value of the library at the time of death is its true value as it passes from me to you, if you will inherit from me. But if you take possession of the library 6 months, a year after, and the value when you actually take possession is more than the value of the time of death, that increase happened on your watch, not on my watch, because I'm dead. So I have no more ownership. And that's why you take the lesser amount, because then that increase happens upon your watch. So just some detail to keep in mind. Now I give you these details keeping in mind that this is not in the commentary. This is like deep hashia literature that you're not going to easily find. So, sometimes it seems esoteric, but I try to give you guys things that I think are important to know. Okay. The reason that's important is that I don't want you to think about the bequest as being just a simple, like, I have $100 and I'm going to give you 1/3 of that. There's a lot more property and estates can be much more complicated. There's money, but there's oftentimes just things, jewelry, clothes. Sometimes mixed in those things is one precious thing. You can find, you read stories all the time that people inherit a painting and they find out it's like a Van Gogh or a Rembrandt and it's a long lost painting. They had no idea, or they find in their backyard some kind of like artifact and they think it's like, whatever, but then the artifact, the next generation, they sell it for like millions of dollars at Sotheby's or, Christie's or something like that. So you hear those stories all the time. So I need you to understand that when we talk about these examples, the reason I'm giving you this background, this caveat, is that the examples in the book are all examples of slavery, which I'm not giving you the slavery example because they're no longer relevant. But this point of law is relevant, which is things have different value, and values can fluctuate up and down. So we want to also take into consideration how we value things. Now, what happens if you come to have a wasiyah that's up to 1/3, etc., but before the wasiyah, we have the debt, and the debt is larger than the entire estate. Well, in that case, obviously the bequest is not going to be distributed because there's no more money. But if somebody came to pay that person's debt, or if the debtor forgave that person's debt, then we would then default then to the bequest, so the bequest still becomes valid. So just because there's a debt that impacts negatively the estate, and there might not be anything left for the bequest, it doesn't mean that we cancel out the bequest altogether. If somebody makes a bequest up to a third or less, but the whole estate is not present, some of the estate is not in the, it's maybe livestock that was shipped somewhere and then coming back or something like that, we have to wait till the estate is whole to make sure that we don't distribute more than the 1/3. In the modern world, that's going to be less likely of a scenario, but we can think of scenarios in which that may be the case. So we need to make sure that everything is there and enumerated and counted for us to be able to properly go through the bequest. Okay, so that was like kind of where we left off, the 1/3. And then the next thing that he says, testamentary bequests are only permissible when their total is less than or equal to 1/3 of the estate. We commented that the fuqaha recommend that it be slightly less than 1/3 for that reason. And then he says the validity of bequest exceeding 1/3 is dependent upon consent of the descendants' heirs. So if somebody leaves a bequest for all of their wealth or half of their wealth, or 1/3 plus a little bit more, anything that's above a 1/3, at the time of death, the people that are actually the inheritors, that are unencumbered, so people that are in full control of their decision making, they're not too young, they're not insane, something like that, they all have to agree to either fulfill that bequest or not fulfill that bequest. So that's a little bit of a tougher situation because you have different people and they're different stages of their life and they might have different opinions. So having all of them agree to something might be a little bit difficult. I'll pick this up in the next clip, inshallah. So the last thing that we were talking about is what happens if somebody leaves more than 1/3 as a bequest. We said in that case, all the people that will inherit, meaning all the people that are actually going to inherit, you can't pre-plan this, it has to happen after the time of death. Given that the people that are going to inherit are, the word is al-mutlaqeen, at-tasarruf. They have absolute unencumbered, that's why I translated it as unencumbered ability to act. So they're not too young or insane or something like that. If those people all agree, then we fulfill the bequest as is. If they don't agree, we will fill up to 1/3 of the bequest, and then the rest of the money we will not, or the rest of the estate we will not give, and that will revert to the whole and be distributed amongst the shares. It is not permissible to bequeath something to one of the heirs unless the other's heir permit it. The hadith that Al-Bayjuri cites, لا وصية لوارث إلا أن يجيز الورثة, he narrates it as being from Al-Bayhaqi with a sound chain of transmission, صحيح. Sorry, بإسناد صالح, not صحيح, صالح, which is another mustalah, and this is one of the words or phraseologies of Imam al-Dhahabi. And in the hadith book, in the Adillah book by Al-Bugha, Mustafa Al-Bugha, we read the narration of Ad-Dar Al-Qutni. Let me just confirm that was Ad-Dar Al-Qutni. Of course, now I lost the page when I needed it the most. 58. Yeah, he narrates the version of Ad-Dar al-Qutni on the authority of Ibn Abbas. لا تجوز وصية لوارث إلا أن يشاء الورثة. And here it's illa an yujiz al-waratha. So it's the same general idea. The differentiation in verbiage is not going to impact the meaning of the hadith. So what is the difference between this and the previous point? If I am going to leave a bequest to my daughter, okay, well, my daughter is an inheritor, or one of my sons, or my wife, or my father, or my mother. These are people that would inherit in a normal circumstances, given, certain situations. In that case, all of the people that will inherit at the time of death have to agree for that bequest to take place. And that's what it means, la wasiyatu liwarith, that there is no bequest for somebody who will already inherit, because they are going to already inherit their share. There's only one scenario where that's an exception, which is if I leave a bequest for my inheritors according to their shares of inheritance. So maybe there's a legal reason that would help make me, during my lifetime, let's say there's like tax saving or property saving or estate saving plans, that if I put my wealth or my estate through a bequest or some kind of trust, it's better. And if I put in that way that they're going to get their allotted shares, then there's no need for the permission, because at the end of the day, what happens at the end of that transaction is that they get their allotted shares, and that's what matters. Okay, I think that's pretty straightforward. Now, who can make a bequest? Bequests are valid for anyone who is mature, of sound mind, to anyone who can own property, or for the sake of Allah Ta'ala Most High. So everyone who is baligh aqil, mature and of sound mind, we've talked about those ad nauseum, so we don't need to talk about that anymore. So in that case, even somebody who's not a Muslim can issue a bequest, and their bequest has to be followed, unless it's not like anything dangerous or against the law or anything like that. And to anybody who can possess. Interestingly, he says in the Hashiyah, وَلَا تَصِحْ لُدَابَّةٍ. You can't give inheritance to, or often you can't give a bequest to an animal. لأنها ليست أهلا للملك. It's not able to possess. إلا أن قصد مالكها, except if you mean the owner of the animal. So we can't leave our estates and give a bequest to, our house animals or pets, because in the Sharia they have no mechanism of ownership. And this comes back to the meta principle of the Sharia of al-milkiyya, حفاظ الملك or حفاظ المال, the right of ownership, the right of property, the right of wealth. This is a meta principle of the Sharia. So this is pretty big stuff, this is pretty serious stuff. And this is one of the things, therefore, that differentiates us between the animals. That their possession, they don't have the power of possession the way we have the power of possession. So anybody basically who's of right mind and mature can issue a bequest to anybody that can hold it. Or fi sabilillah, or to say this is a bequest for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, which would mean that therefore you are donating it to the people in zakah, the categories of the people in zakah. And in that case, it would specifically go to those people who are fighting fi sabilillah in the traditional system, because those are volunteers, and we know that fi sabilillah is one of the categories of zakah. And when we commented about the zakah section, we said that those are the people It's traditionally understood that that is al-jihadu bil jinan, that is a jihad, armed conflict. People that train themselves, buy their own equipment, and then go out to the frontiers and protect the borders and whatnot. Not al-jihadu bil lisan, not the jihad with the tongue, which is, some of the Salaf said that jihad can encompass everything, but in the traditional classical discussion, the assumption is that these are people that are, defending the state. And therefore, specifically, if you say, I'm going to leave a third of my wealth, fi sabilillah, then that's a euphemism, or that's an understanding that that's going to go, therefore, to the ghuza. Those that are going to fight and protecting the homeland, they are going to get that portion of the zakah. So it doesn't have to be to a specific person. It can be something general, as long as there is no ma'asiyah, there is nothing haram in it, involved in that, either the person that you're going to give it to or the item that you're going to give it to. So I can't have a liquor store and say I'm going to give it to my bequest or something, because we can't own that kind of stuff in a Muslim majority context. I kind of skipped over many pages, so let me just back up for a second. So you couldn't give the bequest also to a non-Muslim. That wouldn't count. Just like we can't inherit across religions, we can't do the bequest across religions. As far as the person that can receive the bequest, it could be a young person or an old person, somebody who is fully rational or partially rational, etc. So there's more expanse in the person that can receive the request than the person that can give the request. And we'll wrap this up, inshallah, in the next and final clip. Okay, so the last clip for today, let's wrap up this section. Talked about fi sabilillah. Now we're going to talk about al-isa, which is the person that can basically serve as the executor. Now, one interesting story from the history of Islam and from the history of the Shafi'i madhab is that oftentimes you would leave like your kids in somebody's care just in case you die, young, and this is one of the functions of the executor. And the famous story is that this is exactly what Imam al-Ghazali's father, rahimahullah, radiallahu anhu, he left his Abu Hamid al-Ghazali and his younger brother Ahmad al-Ghazali, who was also a famous Sufi and poet. Not as famous as his brother, but he was also a substantial figure in the history of Tasawwuf. He left them in the care of a pious Sufi friend. And it was that pious Sufi friend who took the young Ghazali brothers to the madrasa, to the school, and made sure that they received their Islamic education. Now just think about the consequence of what that executor did. That he basically supported what was to become Hujjatul Islam, Imam al-Ghazali. And that's just one story. There are hundreds and hundreds of stories of young people that were orphaned at a young age, including our Prophet ﷺ, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So this is a big role. This is not just sort of like a I know it comes here. It's going to seem like when we read it, it's financial, but the executor can do other things. They can look after other things, and it can be a mighty role. Okay, so he says, which is not very surprising. It is valid to appoint someone an executor if he possesses the following 5 qualities. He must be a Muslim. Of course, people that are non-Muslim and non-Muslims, then they can have a non-Muslim person. Has to be of age, has to be mature, of sound mind, free and trustworthy. And then, a sixth condition that's not in the book is able to carry out the tasks. So I think I mentioned that in the introductory clip. It can't be somebody that's very old or very firm, or somebody that's too poor to do it, or incapable of, or very far away, or something like that. So he says, this is the extra one that's not in the text. ويشترط أيضا في الوصي ألا يكون عاجزا عن التصرف. So it's also a condition that this executor is not incapable of carrying out the task. فالعاجز عنه لكبر أو هرم مثلا. So somebody who's old or frail, لا يصح الإيصاء إليه. He cannot be served as an executor. And he says, if a child's mother has these conditions, then she has more of the right to be the executor over the child. Okay. And he says, البيجوري says وَعَلَى مِنْ ذَلِكَ أَنَّ الْأَنُوثَ غَيْرَ مَانِعَ من الوصايا. That womanhood or female is not a preventative for being an executor. And then he quotes the hadith in the Sunan of Abi Dawood on the authority of Umar radiallahu anhu, that he asked Hafsa, his daughter, who was also the wife of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, to be an executor for him. And therein concludes the section. So since we have 5 minutes or a little less, let me just backtrack. This is kind of like, I know this is not the middle lecture, but we are coming to an odd point where we finish the text, and then in the next clip we're going to start another text altogether about the same subject. So kind of let me just take this moment to take a step back and kind of review what we're doing. So we are obviously studying inheritance law, inheritance and bequests. And it's an easy subject, but it's a difficult subject. It's an easy subject because it's just set fractions, and set people are associated with these fractions, and set people block set people either fully or partially. That's basically all it is. But it's difficult because sometimes, at least for me, when you go from theory to practice, there's a little bit of like a stutter step. I mean, for me, I find that, at least for me, that's like, I'll speak for myself. So therefore, it requires a lot of practice. Unfortunately, in these recorded classes, we're not really going to do a lot of the practice. If there is time in the last clip or two, I will try to get like a little white clipboard and show you, and can do some problems and examples together. I found a nice book the other day that has, pages and pages of inheritance equations and problems, and I thought that might be useful. If there's time, depending on how fast I can get through, or by doing justice to the Rahabeya text, which will be the next text that we start. I'll talk about that tomorrow since I don't have to repeat it. So we talked about inheritance being based on blood relations, womb relations, the word that I used, starting with the male lines. We talked about the male inheritors and then the female inheritors. And then we talked about there are some people that always inherit, and some of the people that always inherit are men and women. And there are people that never inherit. And there are universal inheritors, al-asabat. And the universal inheritors are the closest men to the deceased. And we said that if you understand the closeness and the proximity to the deceased, plus the financial responsibility of the person that inherits, it pretty much will give you an understanding of why some people inherit more than others, why some people block other people completely or partially. And then after that, we just simply discussed all the shares, which, there are the 6 shares in the Sharia, the half, the quarter, the eighth, the 2/3, the 1/3, and the 1/6. And then following that, we just took each fraction and we learned who gets that fraction, keeping in mind that the last one that we discussed, 1/6, that's sort of where we see that some people get 1/6 because they've been blocked partially by somebody else. And that's kind of where it gets a little complicated. And then we looked at omissions. Who's omitted by the presence of who? Then we talked about brothers and sisters. That's the famous brothers get twice that of the sisters. And then we entered into the final section that we did yesterday and today, which is bequests, testamentary bequests, and the executors. Keeping in mind, as we said in the beginning of all of this, that even though the inheritance is the last thing that's distributed when a person dies, it's usually the first thing that we talk about in the section of inheritance law because it is complex and because it takes up a lot of mental math and mental power to do the equations. But first we have to get the person washed, shrouded, and buried. That's money taken out from the estate. Then if the person has debts, we pay the debts. If the person has a bequest, the bequest has to be distributed, and then and only then do we distribute the shares of the inheritance. So even though it's heavily talked about, it's also the last thing in distribution. So that's also important to keep in mind. And I had hoped that I would have been able to do this in 7 lectures, but it's actually so short it only took 5. The good news is that it will give us a little bit more space to go through the Rahabeya poem a little bit slower, which is what we're going to start with tomorrow, and which is going to be like we're starting the class from beginning. We're going to have a new text. I'll read the Arabic, read the translation, and then I'll go through the commentary with examples. That's basically what we're going to be doing. It's going to be repetitive because it's the same fiqh. There's nothing that's new. There will be a little bit, I would say, just a couple steps more detail in the Rahabeya poem than what we took. But I will make frequent reference to the Matn of Abi Shuja, especially due to the English translation that we've been using. We will be making reference as we go through because then it will be familiar, and then both, hopefully, they will reinforce one another. Anyway, that's it for today. Wallahu ta'ala a'la wa a'lam wa sallallahu ala sayyidina wa maulana Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam. Alhamdulillah, it's a weird feeling. I feel like we're done, but we're just beginning. But we are done with the section in the Matn of Abi Shuja on inheritance law, which Alhamdulillah, I think it went well. I hope this was useful to you and made sense. I was a little hesitant, to be honest, between you and me before doing the course, but I think it turned out pretty well, and we got into a good level of discussion. In today's class, we wrapped up all of the bequest section. We started by talking about 1/3. That's the key number that we have to remember, that you can leave up to 1/3 of your wealth. And if you leave more than 1/3, all of the people that will inherit have to agree. You cannot leave any bequest to anyone that will naturally inherit unless all the people that will inherit agree to that distribution. If they agree, it's distributed. If you leave more than 1/3 and they don't agree, up to 1/3 will go to the party that you designated to get the bequest, but not the extra. If they agree, then all of it will be taken to the person. If they don't agree that a certain inheritor gets a bequest, then that inheritor doesn't get the bequest at all. And we noted that the only exception is if you left a bequest of an asset of which the shares of that asset would be distributed according to their inheritance share. That doesn't require anyone's permission because, as we say in Arabic, tahsil hasil, they're going to get their share anyway. And then we learned that you can, almost anyone can give a bequest, as if they are sound mind, and you can bequest or leave anything as long as it's not haram. and you can leave something for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, in which case it's like a donation, and then that 1/3 bequest, which is a donation, will go specifically to the people fighting fi sabilillah, that category of the zakah. We talked about that. And then we talked about the executors, and that we said that executors have to be Muslim, mature, sound mind, free, and trustworthy. We also learned that they don't have to be just men, and we also learned that there's another addition that's not in the text but from the commentary and Hasha literature, that they have to be able to carry out their task, especially if they're looking for young children. And I reminded you all that there was an executor that took care of Imam al-Ghazali when his father died, radiallahu anhu. He took care of Imam Abu Hamid al-Ghazali, the famous al-Ghazali, and his younger brother Ahmad, radiallahu anhu, who was a very famous Sufi poet at his time. Those are the main topics that we talked about. I also gave kind of a little bit of a summary of what we're doing. And tomorrow we'll begin the new text. والحمد لله رب العالمين وصلى اللهم على سيدنا مولانا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم.